Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Hey, well, thank you, Sean, for yet again a rousing introduction. And I'm going to tell all the fans out here that miss Sean on the podcast. Sean's getting married in October. Yep. We're going to have a whole podcast from the wedding. It's going to be about a different type of gaming. Anyway, hey, once again, we get great people to come on this show, and it kind of makes for great podcasting. But I'm joined by somebody that I'm excited to talk to today. We share a lot of interests. And I got to walk him around my office building for 2.5 hours. Welcome to the show, Maurice Suckling. How you doing today?
Hello. Thank you very much, Mitch. And thank you again for that rather dizzying tour of the Pentagon. Very easy to get confused as to where you are and what you're doing. And sort of before you know it, you've walked 2 or 3 miles just trying to find where you last turned left. But yeah, I really appreciated that. That was great.
I was exhausted after that, but I had so much fun with you guys. So that was supporting DC Con or Circle DC, which is Kevin, who's been on the show a few times. It was a good time. And most of you guys don't know, but he had some type of temple.
It was a Masonic lodge.
I was a little freaked out by that place.
That's what they wanted you to feel, so you were there appropriately.
Mission successful. That weird stuff going on there. I don't know.
It was connected to the old naval lodge, wasn't it? So I don't quite know how those two institutions intersected there and what particulars.
Well, Navy's a big cult. They all dress alike.
You said that.
Yeah, I did. I went there.
I'm just backing off of that.
Okay. Well, look, I work with a bunch of Navy guys. They understand my love-hate for them. I'll tell you what, my dream job was always to be a captain of a ship.
Wow.
I don't know why.
If you look for my name, if you try to Google me, you will find Maurice Suckling, who is not me, who is far more famous than I am, who was Horatio Nelson's uncle, who was the controller of the Navy during the American Revolution, the British Navy, the Royal Navy.
Any relation?
I don't think so, no, but very much the same name.
I think we should just go with the fact that, that's my great.
Yeah.
Who's going to check? Who's going
to know?
So if any of you guys are diehard board war gamers, you put out a great game, American Revolution. And since I met you, I should have told you this. I bought Freeman's Farm. I've yet to play it. It looks great. But go over your bio and some of the games you designed.
Yes, so Freeman's Farm was the first one that the first one of mine that got published as a board game. So just to backtrack a bit, so before I started making board games, concentrating on historical settings, I spent 20-something years. In fact, I still kind of do this stuff on the side, making video games. So I made my first game was a game called Driver, which was a sort of free roaming open world 3D driving game. It was on the PlayStation in 1999. So I then spent 20-something years making those sorts of things for all sorts of different publishers and lots of different sorts of genres, styles of game. And then I stopped doing that full time about 7 years ago when I'm now upstate New York. I work at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, or RPI.
You know not to call it that, but I'll tell you later why.
Okay, all right. Yeah. So, I'm now part of the Games and Simulation Arts and Sciences program, or GSAS, as they acronym it. And my areas of focus are storytelling in games, which is what I did in video games. I mostly wrote stories for games, or sort of the narrative design, which is kind of an adjacent field. And my other research interest is historical simulations, particularly board games. So yeah, so then Freeman's Farm came out 2019, and then that was with Worthington. And then I made a game with a similar sort of system, but I evolved the system a bit, and that was on Chancellorsville 1863, which I received. I was very happy to get this Charlie, as I believe people like to call them, a Charles S. Roberts Award for.
I was going to mention, didn't that win a Charlie?
Yeah, so it did. I also saw it picked up some confused looks from people who weren't quite sure what it was, because it's not really a traditional war game. It wasn't hex and counter, at least. It sort of had tracks and some hidden movement and screens behind which people did hidden movement. And then I did a game with Dorian. We did a game called Hidden Strike, American Revolution, which is a sort of very, very, very light war game that has a hidden traitor mode mechanic inside it. And then last year, I did a game, 1565 Siege of Malta, which was using, all of these games were with Worthington. That was using Worthington's Great Sieges system that they, I think, first came out with the Quebec game a few years earlier. And to date, so those are the 4 that I've published, and I have one more that's just about to come on Kickstarter with Worthington sometime this month, and that's called Crisis 1914. It's about the July crisis, and we can talk about that in a bit more detail.
Yeah. So freshman year up at Syracuse, I said upstate New York on a street, and this woman stopped me. She goes, "You must be from New York City." And I go, "Obviously." And she goes, "This is Central New York. You should learn something while you're here." And I always found that funny. I still call it upstate New York. So it's okay. Yeah. It's not a real big thing. So, with Freeman's Farm and Chancellorsville, and I forgot it did that one, but I guess I'm more in the mood to play some American Revolutionary games.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's a little different than some of the other games that you took some I'm going to say risks, but it's a little different. How do you kind of develop that game system?
Mostly by I basically left the hobby for 15 years or so, and I grew up playing Avalon Hill games in the 70s, hex and counter stuff, Imperium Romanum, and War and Peace, those sorts of big, heavy, lots of cardboard games. And sometime in the early 90s, I was going to college and life was getting busy, and I think also that the games were getting big and unwieldy in ways that was just not practical, because I didn't have access to a large table that could house a game for several days on end. I just sort of fell away from the hobby. I was becoming less interested in what was being made. I would sort of turn over a box and it would say 4,000 pieces, and instead of that being a selling point for me, that was the opposite. I just was looking for things that were like, 12 pieces and 5 pages of rules, things that had managed to sort of condense things. Anyway, I wasn't seeing that in the hobby. I just fell away from it. I was making video games and trying to get a degree and all of that stuff. And sometime in the early 2000s, I just started getting interested in the hobby again. There was games that were coming out that were very sort of small footprint in terms of table size, in terms of cognitive load. Complexity was lighter. I started playing things like Knizia's Battle Line and this game Condottieri, a very small, compact, card-driven strategy game. And I just started realizing, oh yeah, I like this stuff. In fact, board games was really my first love, and I actually had realized I kind of fell into to video games. I started playing them some more. These sort of lighter footprint kinds of games. Quartermaster General was a game that I played around this time. I played it and thought, oh, this is really interesting. This actually is the sort of game that I'm interested in designing. With some of these approaches, and it made me think, maybe there's actually an audience for the sort of game that I would like to make. And in the case of Chancellorsville, that game is that battle is fundamentally, to me, about maneuver and that Jackson flanking march. And if you didn't find a system that could represent that, I wasn't really sure why you would make the game. Was kind of my somewhat belligerent stance on it. I felt there were a lot of conventions that were not helping, that were not actually conducive to representing the really interesting bits of military history. So in some way, the answer to that question is I came up with that system through being disconnected in all sorts of ways from the hobby for such a long time that I was able to see it in new light. I was less bound by certain conventions, and I did, in a way I was taking risks, but in a way I was taking no risks because no one knew me. And in my job I had a salary, which is why I pretty much didn't make board games while I was a freelancer for 20 something years. And the worst that would happen is that Worthington would say, don't make, we don't thank you, but we don't want to make it. And I would go, oh, okay, well, I haven't really lost that much. I just was interested in it, and I was experimenting. And when I made Freeman's Farm, I didn't know that I really was a board game designer. I just sort of found out that I was when they said, yeah, we want to publish it. And then that got nominated for a Charlie 2. And then people started saying nice things about it. And I started thinking, oh, that's interesting, because I actually have lots of other ideas if people are interested. So I suppose I had a degree of confidence that let me just launch myself back into things that I wanted to make. And I know that some people haven't reacted positively to some of those experiments, and that's okay, because those other less experimental games still exist. That no one's taking them away. I'm not taking them away from anyone or saying you can't play them. I'm just saying, here's something else that maybe has a different perspective.
Yeah, and that's that's important. I used to tell folks, because I work with a lot of folks that are designing games, and I'm like, don't read the press clippings, and definitely don't respond to them, because gamers, it's I've had this talk many times. Actually, I had to talk with our mutual friend Ross. It's a very unusual community. They like what they like, but they don't know what they like. And I find it interesting, especially being a voyeur of it, running a website that talks about it. So it goes into our first kind of standard question we always ask. There was a game you played at one time in your life that you knew this was a lifelong addiction. What game was that?
Maybe it was War and Peace. Maybe it was Mark McLaughlin's War and Peace, the 1980, early 1980 edition. Although, actually, I think even before that, probably a year or so before that, I played Kingmaker, the old Gibson Games Kingmaker, which is sort of much more of a chaotic kind of experience. I don't know if do you know that game, Mitch?
I've heard of it, never played it.
Yeah, it did just get a re-release last year, I think, or I think the Kickstarter's shipped last year. But so that's about the Wars of the Roses. The so-called Wars of the Roses, that one of the civil wars in late medieval Britain between the House of Lancaster and the House of York, which went on for many decades. And I used to love playing that with my brothers. I only had two brothers, so it doesn't really work that well as a 3-player game. In fact, it really needs more like 5 or 6. But some of the sort of what I guess my uh, academic hat on, I would call these emergent storytelling systems, where
Mm-hmm.
you you've got all the cards, you've got the king in your metaphorical pocket, and you are very difficult to defeat in terms of just you have so many soldiers at your disposal, and then you hold up in I don't know, York or somewhere, and find that next turn the plague happens and destroys everything that you built. Are just tremendously memorable as little systems for creating these stories within that game world. And yeah, so maybe that was the one. That was a game that my older brother had bought, and just opened my eyes to what was possible. And then off the back of that, then I started to understand about the Avalon Hill stuff. I was always really impressed by diplomacy. So diplomacy was I was saying earlier about how I really like these games with elegant designs, right? It's very few pieces, very few rules, and that the game is mostly that's really a game about psychology more than anything. And although I can't say I like to play it that much, I do really admire the design thinking in that, and it feels like just a tremendously, like I said before, elegant way of trying to speak about some period of history. It's not really what I would call in any way a simulation. It does give you it does depict some geopolitical axes prior to World War One, but in fact, there's a connection there to my Crisis game, which in a way, diplomacy is, when I first played that, around the same sort of time as I was playing Kingmaker and those early Avalon Hill, or for me, early Avalon Hill games. I was playing Diplomacy 2, and I was fascinated in this idea of this tension building before the war. And of course, Diplomacy really is essentially from the first turn, you're at war in a sort of a weird, sort of messy kind of way, that he doesn't really have any interest in depicting tension prior to war.
Mm-hmm.
Your moves, they manifest as moves connected to war. You're moving armies and fleets and so on. But I was always interested in what would a game look like that tried to represent the tension before war breaks out. And so I went on a whole odyssey of playing things like Pax Britannica and trying to sort of scratch an itch as a player that never really got scratched. That in a way, my Crisis game is an attempt to sort of try and, I guess, scratch that in a way.
Yeah. Most people say, the favorite game that started me is a trick question. I had a D6 when I came out of the womb. So, but you talk about diplomacy. It's interesting. When I ask people to explain it, they often explain it like you just did, where it's one of those things you kind of have to play it to understand what it's about, but it has a very simple title, Diplomacy. And it's interesting. It's definitely a classic. I still remember that box somewhere on my shelf. And it was a game I didn't play very often because you need the right kind of people to play that game.
Yeah.
Which, and I think 13-year-old me I'm going to just launch into my first love about reading is The Great War. And I know folks are going to say, okay, this is why he's here, because of the Great War. No, I wanted him on the podcast well before I knew he was doing this game. Now, when it comes to games about the Great War, I was kind of a little upset. We just went through the centennial of the Great War, and I expected games to come out like every other week, and it didn't. And, a couple of years ago, we had Dana Lombardi with his card game, and I just saw him 2 weeks ago. Great guy. About the Great War, and the same question I'll recycle. Why isn't it gamed that much? And is it gamed well enough with the games that are out there, in your opinion?
Well, in some ways, I'd push back a little bit and say that I think in the last few years, it did miss the centenary, but there are a few things that have come out over the last 5 or 6 years. So I'm thinking of Fields of Despair, for example, the block game that I only played a little bit, but that sort of seems to, people seem to enjoy that. There's the Grizzled. I don't know if you ever played that, which it's not really it's not a war game in most definitions of it, but it's a game about friendship. It's a game about surviving the war.
What a great game
together. Yeah, beautiful game. I mean, I think that one of probably a kind of traditional answer that you might receive to a question like that would be to do with the messiness of it, in terms of at a strategic level, it could be somewhat frustrating, right? That it feels like there's not much movement of sorts. But I'm trying to think. There was the PSC published the Great War, didn't they?
It was the Berg design from
yes,
the
that's it.
Commands and
Yeah,
Colors, which
that's right. Yeah,
came out on tablet and computer, which is it's a light game, but everything in that series kind of is light, but they're still great games. My favorite would be Verdun Steel Inferno that came out in France.
Yeah, Ronco taught me that when I went to see him.
He loves that game.
Yeah, and I bought it and been meaning to get back to it, and just haven't yet. But yes, so that I'm a big fan of. I mentioned Quartermaster General, that Ian Brody brought out a World War One version of that, Quartermaster General 1914, which is super high level, fast strategic level game, which I've enjoyed a lot. I probably would say that's one of my favorite games, but particularly that 1914 one. It sort of addresses attrition as well in a thoughtful way.
I have it. I've never played it. So next time we're in the same location, we will play it.
Yeah, I'd love to teach you that. I think that's a really great game. I think that I'm behind. So Compass brought out several strategic level World War One games in the last 5 or 6 years. Things like Imperial Tide and Attrition of Souls. I have one of them, but I don't think I've cracked it open yet. But I think that people have struggled to find ways of making it feel dynamic. Next to sort of concepts that we're used to seeing in World War II games, like Blitzkrieg and things moving fast and being super dynamic, and aircraft having range and paratroopers. I guess I feel as if in sort of popular consciousness, World War One can seem somewhat perhaps drab, and feel as if there's an awful lot of
and
smashing at things without anything,
because
happening.
Right away we start thinking about the trenches, and when Walter from Fellowship of Simulations was putting artwork out there with the Verdun game, I'm like, oh, Daddy got to see this. So he sent me a copy of the rules. He's a really good guy. And then I played it, and I'm like, wow, you made attritional warfare fun. It is such a really good game. So it kind of goes into the second part of the question. Sometimes they're just not done right, or to the scale where I could play it in 2 hours, which goes back to what you were saying earlier about these monster games. We got an interesting marketplace.
I just think that we're finding design tools, which I think we're, well, certainly in my case, happily acknowledge that it's sort of absorbing from what we might describe as Euro games. I'm finding that these mechanisms are tremendously useful. One of the games I remember playing a lot as a 12, 13-year-old was Guns of August, second World War I strategic level, right? So now there's a game, Hexes, and I think it's 3 units is the stacking limit, plus an artillery piece, right? So on each hex, you've got 4. So you're talking about 4 units, right? And if you're looking at the Western Front, it's a cat's dream, isn't it? Just to look at that and just think what damage you could do by just nudging the table, and you're sort of nudging these stacks incrementally, or kind of often picking them off to try and pick them up one by one to see what's in there, to do the maths you need to do to calculate the combat results table, and then maybe no one's moving, right? And then cut to 3 hours later, and the board doesn't look that much different. So I think that we were just trying to use the wrong sorts of design tools to crack that particular problem. And I think in some ways the doors are blown open now, that there's all of these kinds of approaches that we can take. Verdun is using card-driven systems, and Grizzled we were just talking about is essentially it's a push your luck card game mechanic. So I think that now, if you just we've tried it the old way, and it wasn't all that satisfying for an awful lot of people, and now we're coming back at these topics, these familiar topics in some cases, and in some cases new topics that have never been addressed, and finding we've got design tools, mechanisms that we can better apply to get more fruitful metaphors, to build more sort of fruitful analogies in our connection between the mechanism and the story that we're trying to address, the history we're trying to hit. So
which I plan on getting back to. It's already on my note thing, so I definitely want to talk about that in a minute. But go ahead, sir.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that I just think we struggled for a long time. We were sort of stuck in a certain kind of gear. I mean, when I think about the trajectory for my Crisis game, I did an article recently wrote an article for the Conflicts of Interest magazine that Harold and Andrew edit, and in a way, the piece was not really about the specific development of this game, which really has happened over the last year, but it was really about the stuff that happened all sort of the sort of 40 years of pre-development before I really realized what I was interested in, and why I was interested in what it was I was trying to do. I hadn't really understood what it was.
Well,
and in that sort of journey, one of the things, so diplomacy was kind of the start of that story, which I mentioned before, but I also mentioned Pax Britannica, which was one of the earlier experiences I had. But one of the games in between there was a game that Jim Dunnigan made, which was called Origins of World War One. I found it inside a collection, a book called Sid Sackson's Gamut of Games. It's about 3 pages long, 2 pages of rules and about a page of charts. And that was a game about the origins of World War One, right? But it really, you would think, therefore, it was a game about diplomacy. It was a game about, perhaps brinkmanship, or a game about political positioning. And it was only insofar as that's some of the words that we use, but it's essentially, it has a combat results table that it works off of standard odds. It's essentially a war game in everything but name.
Well, it was Jim Dunnigan, so it has to have a series.
Yeah. So, I ended up being obviously disappointed by that game, because I felt like, well, it scratches an itch in terms of a sort of a story that I wanted to experience in an interactive way, but it didn't in any way make me feel like, oh, this is speaking to the political and diplomatic dimensions involved in this key element, key event, or key series of events in history. So, I think they're just the wrong tools to attempt what we were trying to attempt. And I think that now, they're there. We can find people like Jeff Engelstein wrote this great. He co-wrote it. I don't remember the name of his co-writer, but he did an encyclopedia of tabletop game mechanics, which is a few hundred pages long, which is a really great resource for designers. Isaac Shalev is his co-designer, building blocks of tabletop game design. It's an encyclopedia of mechanisms.
Folks out there, if you can get any of Jeff's games, at work I have Craft of Wargaming heavily highlighted at work, and people are like, why do you have that? I said, well, they go, have you read it? I'm like, no, I just have it. No, it's for you to read, so I don't have to teach you all these things, because it's well written, and you can easily understand it. They're great. So I think we've been teasing the audience enough. So let's talk about Crisis 1914, if that's okay with you. So
Sure.
I was reading your historical design notes, and right away, you take this iconoclastic view, which I dig. The assassinations in Sarajevo and the so-called July crisis that ensued did not lead inevitably to full-scale European/World War in August. And you quote, and I'm like thinking that, and I sent to Maurice, I am before, like we read the same damn books. It's an interesting concept because you're using almost a political theory to then that is kind of different than a lot of people. If I were to stop anybody on the street and say, did the assassination of Franz Ferdinand lead to the Great War? And they would say, I didn't know the band got shot. Into a game. Tell me why you latched onto this and then went into the design process based on this premise.
Yeah, well, I remember being at school learning history, and I put this complicated flowchart diagram together to show how all of these different elements, the Anglo-German naval arms race and imperial competition in Africa and Asia and so on, how they end up inevitably leading to war. There's this common conception of thinking about Europe as this powder keg, and it just needs a spark and up it goes. And that kind of served me fine as a 16, 17-year-old. But I just remain fascinated by this topic. It's there's a quote I like about this World War I being the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, and it's a fascinating hinge point to think about how history might have been different had it not occurred. Anyway, the more that I read around that subject, the more it seems as if it's less supportable to think in terms of war as just being absolutely inevitable, that it must happen. There are certain people who take that view, who consider that Germany was very much interested in a what they call a preventative war. That's to say, it's a preemptive war to kind of strike while they could before they got out-muscled by the growing power of Russia, that was rebuilding itself after the disaster of the Russo-Japanese War. So there are people who take that view, but there are lots of people who felt at the time that, well, war was becoming less likely. People, this economist Angel wrote a book about how war was not going to happen in the future. This is just in the early parts of the 20th century, because it just was too expensive. People would understand that it just made no sense, that it was not. The global economies were so interconnected that everything would fall apart, and people would understand that. And in all sorts of other ways, we see tension dissipating rather than building. The Anglo-German arms race was really over by 1914. The British had won. They'd outbuilt the German Navy, and the German Navy understood that, and they were backing off. Things that the tension was dissipating there. And in all sorts of ways, we can look at ways in which had they got had they got through 1914, it's possible that that was the most dangerous part, that certain tensions might have cooled further. So anyway, in terms of the sort of the history that I've been reading, there's some reason to support that. But also from a game design perspective, I think that what historical games do particularly well is they shine a focus on the contingency of history, right? It's very, very easy to read history as being inevitable, to see, well, this happened, of course it happened because we're here now, so that must have been inevitable. But it often doesn't feel inevitable to people in the middle of it. And I think there's lots of arguments to say it really isn't inevitable. There are ways in which things work out differently. So games, I think, can do this. Probably the thing they can do best as history games is to shine a light on that, and to say hey, this is contingent. This could have gone other ways, and by kind of building these models that represent that, you get to play about in that and reimagine the contingency of it all, right? The possibility of different kinds of outcomes. So, and this is a story where you were sort of alluding to there in that little brief description. The assassination happens on the 28th of June. The mobilizations don't happen until the very end of July, the beginning of August. So what happens in that month is fascinating, and there's lots of historians have written very eloquently about this as things kind of swayed backwards and forwards as people, initially the Austro-Hungarians are very keen for war, apart from the Count Tiso, the prime minister of Hungary, who's very much not wanting to push war, not because he cares about Serbs, but because of the opposite, because he doesn't want Serbs in the empire, because this undermines the position of Hungarians. He's Hungarian himself within their empire, who are barely struggling to kind of have any dominance over things as it is. So, but they're generally keen for war, a localized war against Serbia. The Germans initially, in general, are very, the Kaiser in particular is very supportive of this idea. There's some strategic thinking that the Austro-Hungarians should march straight into Belgrade and just do it, so that it's a fait accompli, and that everyone else will be sort of off balance and not really be able to react. But these attitudes are not monolithic. These are not the problems that all of these major diplomats are confronting. In the game, you play one of the major diplomats from that each respective of the five major nations. One of the problems that you're dealing with is not everyone who is on your side, in inverted commas, is on your side. There are plenty of people who might be British, for example, who don't want war, who are very much pushing in the opposite direction. You're trying to shepherd them and corral them into a position where you've got some coherent policy response. And at certain times, the doves are winning. At certain times, the hawks are winning. And there are different sorts of motivations and objectives in each case. So this, to me, is just a fascinating story. And it feels to me as if, hey, if you just short circuit it to the assassination and now, okay, off we go, and the Schlieffen plan is in progress, it feels as if you miss some really fascinating parts of history, some really fascinating parts of human mentality, and just you short circuit what is a fascinating story of in some ways systemic failures, of misunderstanding, of just imbalance and wrong thinking and confused thinking. And in a way, it makes it even more of a tragedy than it already was, because it felt as if there are several points at which war could have been averted. It might have been stopped. There are ways in which we can see that war doesn't happen.
Yeah, so I remember in War College, we covered Great War, and I'm sitting there smiling. I love that stuff. And as we were talking about it, like, it comes up, how could the war could have been averted? And I'm like, mobile phones. They had mobile phones. This thing would have never happened. And it was a joke, but it's, they were talking to each other, hearing what they wanted to hear, and it was like a series of tragic mistakes. And you had competing priorities for all the nations involved, and a lot of them, it really comes down to hubris. This is never going to happen, and it did. And I think it was the most watershed moment, the most dynamic 4 years of the history of, I'd say, the world, because so much changed. If you look at Europe before the war and how things were set upon with a unwritten order of how things should happen, and then to lose a generation in trenches or in Africa and all over the world, and in Russia, and the steppes of Russia. It was a huge cultural shock. And I think it's framed everything that we've seen up till today. Because if you look at the problems we have now with the dude in Russia, you see a little bit of DNA from Russia's Great War tragedy as well. And I just find it interesting. And especially, I find the assassination of the Archduke. I have a sandwich. I have a T-shirt with Gorilla Princip's face on it, and it says "Hold my sandwich." And whenever we do a Great War game, I always wear it. It's kind of interesting. Somebody's like, well, historians have never proved whether or not that actually he was actually getting a sandwich at the deli, but it makes for a great meme. But I got a chance to go to Sarajevo, to go to that bridge where the car turned around, and one lucky shot.
I mean, I think the other shot, he was aiming for the Patoriak, wasn't he? The Austrian-Hungarian governor. He killed. He killed Sophie instead. But I mean, it's just a riveting, like I say, it's sort of shaking the whole foundations of history in lots of ways at that moment. Of course, it gives rise to what the US's global status, also Japan. Also, I think you can start to see the first rehabilitations of China from into a sort of perhaps a more respected place amongst the nations from its contributions in World War One, II. So, but also, I don't think you're entirely flippant about the phone. There's a reason why after the missile crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, those guys installed phones at the presidential level so that they could talk to each other, and that kind of that timing, that lack of ability to know for sure exactly when something had happened, and is part of what's going on. The famous Willie Nicky, these letters that the Kaiser writes to his cousin, the Tsar Nicholas, but they're writing in English because that's their mutual language. Of course, they're cousins related to Queen Victoria, and you can get the sense that if they get at it too late, and neither of them are really in control of their respective states. Certainly by the time that those conversations are beginning. But you could imagine that if they had phones, they were talking to each other much earlier on, that things might have been averted. Sorry,
they'll go on vacation. That's the other one, right?
Yeah. So the Kaiser goes on vacation. He's up in Norway on his yacht.
Yep.
He's away for a couple of weeks. Yes, there's
so much there. So as you went to gamify this, what were some of your bigger? Well, actually, let's just give an overview of the game, because you and I are going off the fact that I've just read all this stuff earlier today. And thanks for sending me that message. I totally lost situational awareness on this week so far. I'm still exhausted from the game I played yesterday. But,
what did you play?
We played A Most Fearful Sacrifice, Day 2, The Long Street Attacks. Marvelous game, beautiful looking game. And I was asked, is this your favorite Gettysburg game? And I'm like, definitively it is. Well, are you sure? Yeah, because I think I've played all the other ones, which is bullshit, because there's a lot.
In fact, Worthington sent me one recently, which I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but someone, I think he's in the UK, has designed, basically taken my Chancellorsville model, but that system in that design, and built a Gettysburg game. So it has some hidden movement, and it's sort of, Worthington described it as a mix between my Freeman's Farm and my Chancellorsville, through doing Gettysburg, basically. So the point being, there's going to be another one for you to put on your shelf list.
Well, I can't. I've found the ultimate game. I can't. That would mean like no, and I just put a bid in for the Chancellorsville game. So there we go. Right?
Okay.
But yeah, I mean, it's looking at. Actually, I'm going to have you talk about the game because your game, and I'll just comment.
Yeah. So I think your question was basically, how does the game work?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So it is a game about brinkmanship. It's a game about so one way to describe it is like a tug of war, where if you pull too hard and you win too hard, you lose. So if you there are two key concepts in the game. One is prestige, and the other is tension. Prestige is how you win the game. You have the most prestige at the end of the game, you win. And prestige is, that's you asserting your nation's stature. You're using this diplomatic crisis in order to assert yourself. That makes you a good diplomat. What makes you a bad diplomat is not asserting yourself sufficiently, not scoring enough prestige, or asserting yourself so much that you're generating what the game calls tension. And the tension that you build is what drives your opponents to mobilize. And if they mobilize, in this game, you lose because you cause them to mobilize, you cause the war to start. So you're trying to sort of walk this tightrope of, hey, I want to assert myself, I want to push my prestige, but I also don't want anyone to mobilize. So, there's some arguments there from the historical side, which is that, well, hey, if I'm Germany and you take the view that Germany's leading the dance and wants a European war to happen, then it's at odds with that kind of perspective. But that's not a universally held perspective, and the arguments against it. In essence, in this game, every player is in the same sort of position where they want to assert their prestige, they want to avoid tension, they all want to avoid a European-wide, worldwide scale war. Austria-Hungary might be interested in a war with Serbia. That's sort of to one side, really, in terms of the game concept. So you're going to push your prestige up by managing your hand. The essence of how I've represented this game, which we can think about really as being essentially about brinkmanship, is, so the metaphor for that, if you like, is hand management and tableau building. So you're building cards, you're building a tableau from a deck of cards that are getting you points that you need, which the game calls diplomatic pressure points, and you get more of those, you get prestige. You get too much prestige, you might get tension anyway. But so you've got these decks of cards. Each player has a deck of cards, 24 cards, and so each player takes. In the case of Austria-Hungary, we've got Bechtold, the foreign minister in Russia. In the case of Russia, we have Sazonov, who's the foreign minister. Germany, we have Bethmann Hollweg, who is the chancellor. France, we have Raymond Poincaré, who is the president. And we have Edward Grey, who's the British foreign secretary. So you're taking on these roles, and you are trying to corral your cabinet, but also not just your cabinet, also the wider government, some of the people who are in opposition to your government, and you're working with other sorts of concepts that are adjacent or pertinent to your position in this crisis. It might be to do with the fact that you've got a pre-existing alliance, or it might be to do with the fact that you've got a pre-existing strategic mindset that pushes you in a certain kind of way. Anyway, these cards are going to come out of your deck, and you have ways of managing them and controlling them so that you get closer to what you want, but you can't necessarily be sure that you are always going to get the cards that you want to go on the table at the time. Each card is represented what I call these diplomatic pressure points, and it's every card has a value from 0 to 4. So 0 would be might be someone in your cabinet or government who is very much a dove, who's saying we should not be engaging in war at all. We should be very much taking for whatever reason, a non-belligerent stance. And a 4 represents someone or a concept that is very much driving you to being more assertive. And depending on where you are in a round, where you are in a week, the game is divided into 6 game weeks. Mm-hmm. You either want high total cards or you want low total cards, and you're trying to kind of get yourself over the line, but you're watching everyone else. So you score prestige by having the most diplomatic pressure points at the end of the week. But if you are starting to get nervous about how much tension you're creating, you're looking to one side and you're checking the other players and saying, well, they're still going, they're still pushing things up. So maybe I want to follow them because I care about points that I need to win. So it's this sort of push me, pull me kind of concept at the heart of it, which I guess I would describe as a sort of, it's not a simulation, right? Because it's not detailed enough, and it's not, it doesn't represent all concepts in a framework that is defensible in terms of rationale and detail. But it's what I'd call a simulation by abstraction. That's to say, there's sufficient truths in what it is trying to address, most particularly the kind of feeling of unease that I want players to have, of kind of wanting to push, but then kind of feeling like I might make things explode if I push too hard here. Yeah, right. So you can think about it as a whole to push your luck mechanic, which is really what brinkmanship is about. The heart of this is the game that game theorists and in fact everyone really knows as chicken, right? And that's the essence of this. So, do you back down? Well, I will if you do, but hopefully you'll back down first, because I sure as hell don't want to slam into this brick wall, because that's what's coming if I don't pull out of the way. But then you're not moving, so what do I do? I guess I keep going. So, that's kind of, to me, true in terms of my reading of this history. This is what a number of those key diplomats were encountering or experiencing at the time. And I'm just finding ways, game mechanics, to represent that, to kind of give them that sensation.
Yeah, and speaking of which, our mutual friend Ross said he is the best, talking about you. I don't have enough words to express my respect and admiration for him. His game of development, 1914, looks really awesome. That's pretty good.
Well, yeah, yeah, Ross is great, and we've been friends for, I'm not sure, maybe 15, maybe 20 years now. We don't get to see each other very often, but we stay in touch quite a lot. Like I said, he did some teaching for me while I was on paternity leave, and I wrote a chapter for him on storytelling in board games for his book that came out last year, I think it was, on new narrative techniques and approaches.
Oh, I'm gonna have to read that.
Yeah, so I mean, Ross is a wonderful guy and super interesting and super interested in all kinds of things. I'm glad he went to Connections and got a chance to meet you.
Yeah, it's it's I hope to know him for another 15 years, but everybody knows I'm an asshole. From looking at what you sent me, it's first of all, everybody out, yes, of course, there's a solo version of it. No games that are being put out today that if a game wants to have success in the marketplace, it has to be soloable. And we had a whole talk about that yesterday when we were playing. But it kind of looks interesting. And in your play testing, by the way, I've not, I volunteer to be a play tester anytime for anybody. I think Maurice knows that. Do you see the players wanting to repeat history, or do they work really hard to try to avoid a major conflict?
So,
or is it out of their control?
Just quickly on that solo mode topic. It's definitely a different game when you play solo. So you just play as the Austro-Hungarian deck, and you're playing against yourself, trying to sort of get a best score, if you see what I mean. But it's possible for you to destroy your own attempts to score prestige by pushing things too hard and therefore causing yourself to mobilize. So it's definitely a different game. It's just that it was more. It felt more perverse to remove a solo version than to. It wasn't that I kind of finished it and then thought, oh, let me add one. That it kind of came with the design, because I designed it so it was scalable in the first place, right? So that when I was testing it early on, I would just play the Austro-Hungarian deck, and if you have 2 players, you add the Russian player. If you have 3, you add the German player. 4, you add the French player, and the 5, you add the British player. So the design inherently had this sort of scalable quality to it. I am sensible to the argument that it feels like, I'm not sure that every game has to have a solo mode, right? And there are some games that really would be better probably without it. I'm working on one now that is just a 2-player game. It will not have a solo game that I make, and I don't see how you could make one that would be interesting. So that's how that will work. And
then aside from that, I think it's something that the marketplace puts on game designers, which I don't consider 100% fair, because some games, I am of the impression or the belief that a solo game should be designed ground up as a solo game. A 2-player, a multiplayer, much the same, because there's art within creating a game. So my 2 cents, and I'm sure I'll get hate mail for that.
No, I mean, I largely agree. In this particular case, because the cards, at least for 3 of the decks, are such that there are cards that can join your decks that can defeat you, that can cause you to mobilize when we know that you don't want to do that, because that's not how the game works. That's not how you win the game. Because the game has that built into it, it was easy enough. The rule changes, like basically it's a page of rules. Probably half a page the way that it actually be formatted to allow you to play solo mode. So like I said, it was just like more perverse to just not permit it than to kind of search somehow to try and figure out how do I make this soloable. But you asked a question there about how do I see players responding, like in terms of do they want to repeat history or not? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And my answer to that is that if I've done my job right, the mechanisms should be compelling people to a certain kind of play. And that's certainly what I've seen in playtesting, which is that they keep pushing their luck, right? They just keep thinking, I'm just going to go a bit further. I'm going to try get more diplomatic pressure points, find this big card that will make sure that I win this week. So that's what I'm seeing. So I mean, there's systems within the game that mean that at a certain point you have to stop drawing cards, but that's also part of the tension, because you're trying to judge it right so that you've got the highest level cards that you want at the right time, but sometimes you want lower cards so that other people are still drawing cards and you're hanging back behind them to see how high they're going to push the tension. But I'm basically seeing, that people are in that design space, right, that I wanted them to be in, which is they have this desire to push, but they keep looking over their shoulder thinking, my tension's getting high. As soon as, so in terms of just the numbers, and there are lots of dice in this game, right? But none of them are used for rolling. They're all just used for trackers. So 6 points, if you had 6 points of tension, if you apply that to someone else, if Germany is pushing its prestige up to such an extent that Russia generates 6 points of tension on Russia, then Germany loses. So you're just turning a die face each time to kind of track that score. And I track the prestige similarly with in that case white dice that are just going up from 1 to 6. It just became a simple mechanism to avoid lots of different tracks that were susceptible to just being knocked over. For example, it's a bit harder to knock a dice over, right, and to kind of change its face.
Yeah. It sounds like they were having fun while they were playing. Which,
Yes.
believe it or not, is a goal of these games. I hope.
Oh my goodness, yes, yeah, that is the hope. I think that, yeah, in that particular, if you're talking about the one at C, the guys who were playing the Germans were just pushing the tension up very, very high because they had to leave, right? So they were just like, well, let's see what happens. And what happens is the game kind of ends. so the game ostensibly lasts 6 game weeks, but it can end much sooner if people play extremely belligerently.
Which is awesome. I think player agency in games is something that I always talk to new designers about, and I think it's something that the community doesn't understand. Well, they want gamers to design games that kind of, the more rules you have, people do the finger test. Either they're never going to play the game, but a lot of them buy it. Think of the rule book, the more realistic it has to be. But, I know this is big in the miniatures world. I do a lot of stuff in the miniatures world. It's, well, in the Great War game, you didn't put the Canadians in. I go, Canadians had the same order of battle as all the other Commonwealth on the Western Front. Hey, guess what? Why don't you play them aggressively like Canadians? It's all there for you. You have player agency. Oh, no. Well, why do I want to do that? So you want me to come over and tell you how to play? I don't get that. But it seems like, if all of the actions in Crisis 1914, they're making those decisions. And some of it is, it's a game. Some of it is enemy gets a vote. Some of it's out of your hands. And they're having fun playing it. It means that I think it's going to be a great game. And from the looks of what I'm looking at, I'm definitely back in this day one. But
Wonderful.
As you went to playtest, were you eliciting the responses that you as a designer say, this is a pretty good game? Or, you're more humble?
I was getting those at by the time the game was at Circle DC. But some games have easier design journeys than others, right? And this was one that, quite apart from the 40 years that I spent trying to, not being sure what it was I was trying to make, and making lots of things that was sort of tangential, were kind of in this space but not really it. Even when I settled on last year, this is what I'm actually trying to do. This is the game I'm trying to make, because I'd actually taken a game that was on this same topic, but I approached it in a very different way. I played it with Jason Matthews, and Kevin Bertram played it with me.
Kevin loved it. Both of them loved the game, by the way.
Well, that's nice of them to say, but I ended up not pursuing that design. I took it in a different direction. That was a co-op game where you were trying to prevent the war from happening. That was your task, was to stop the war from happening. To the crisis begins, and you set about your task as a diplomat, trying to cool everyone down, mostly in your own headquarters, right, in your own home. And I just kind of sat on it for a bit, and I realized I don't actually, that has a place, that kind of fantasy alternative history element, right? But that was not the motivations of any of the key players in the crisis. I mean, you could probably say, well, Edward Grey probably somewhat aligned with that, but sure, he wanted the status quo to exist because Britain was a preeminent power, so no wonder he wanted the status quo to be sustained. But I took a different tack on it. I sat on it for a bit, and I decided, I think I'm just not being true to the essence of what this story is, and I'm letting my own desire for this kind of wonderful counterfactual history where the war can be stopped, I'm letting that get in the way of the history. So, and then I spent this game this is a long way around trying to answer that question, which I think
No, it's fine.
This game had a lot of playtesting. I had a student. His name was Eric Ritz, and he was doing a semester away. So RPI students do the semester away, and he didn't find anywhere he could do it. And he said, could he do it with me? Sort of being attached really to a game design project. In fact, he was attached to several. I used him as a playtester. We playtested Crisis for about a year, every week for about 2 hours. And sometimes we had 3 players. Sometimes it was just me and him. Sometimes it was just him. There was another guy, Philip. I can't remember his surname, but he was just doing solo playtesting for about 3 months. And then sometimes Eric and I would have 4 players or 5 players. Sometimes I would take the game, be not with Eric, it'd be other people. But in that time, it evolved a lot. So it didn't get to that point until probably a few weeks before Circle DC, where I thought, okay, now it's in the place where it needs to be. There were lots of just adjustments I needed to make to get the mechanisms to work as the metaphors I wish them to be. So I talked a bit about the sort of hand management, and the tableau building is a metaphor for you trying to corral, encourage, build a consensus amongst your government. But there are other actions that you might take whereby you discard cards from your hand to deliberate, to get more cards, but some of them you have to play, or one of them you have to play, or you reorganize, which means you're just looking at the cards on your draw pile, you're putting them in a different order, which represents you slowing down, but knowing what's going to happen. There's reasons why you might not want to be slow, because there's a concept of diplomatic initiative, which means that's worth a certain amount of prestige points at the end of each week, and there are certain ways of gaining or losing initiative. Anyway, all of these things, they didn't come into my head this time last year fully formed. They took some time, and like I said, a lot of hours. It's probably the most play tested game I've ever designed, and kind of got to this development stage. It just took a lot of figuring out to make it look as elegant as it is. So the rules are not big. There's not many, but you were saying earlier about those kind of heavy, complex rules. When I see those, I tend to feel like the designer's asking me to do work. I'm feeling like if you had sat on this longer, you would have found a more elegant way to condense this such that I had less work to do. It's kind of how I feel about it.
You bring up something interesting, because I get sent a lot of games that people want to go put in production, and I'll explain to them, like, you overbake the game, and you're now not disputing that, but like, it's almost, you want to overbake the game, but you kind of want to massage out what the game is trying to do and find better ways to immerse the player in that experience. But I think overbaking games is a problem we have. But your approach about let this marinate for a little while longer and you'll figure out a better way is something that, I guess I do believe in it. It's just we seldom ever say that. And I wonder why that is, because game design is not easy. But if you go on social media, everybody could design the world's best game. They just haven't. You know what I'm talking about. So it's a lot of people ask me about that process, and especially when we take the students, at Georgetown, and Sebastian goes, "You got to get a game in 4 months," and maybe they take the class because they think it's an easy A. They're going to play Chutes and Ladders, but it's hard to do that. But I noticed that a lot of game designers tend to overbake, not marinate. I get extra points if I use food terms from the Food Network, so we got to drop that in here. But,
I mean, it's about focus, right? If you're clear about what it is that you're trying to do, that will really help you. That's why I spent 40 years kind of not making this game, because I wasn't clear for most of that time what I was actually trying to do. I sort of, it just kept turning into a game about imperial rivalry. And it turned out when I identified that that isn't actually what I'm interested in. I'm interested in pre-war tension and ways in which war might be averted, and how brinkmanship is a part of that diplomatic process. Then it became much more straightforward. In some ways, there's this sort of hangover from the romanticism era, from the sort of late 1700s or sort of early 1800s, that this idea that the thing can only be good if you give it time. Paradoxically, they also give us this concept of spontaneity, of kind of something only being good if it's spontaneous and kind of divinely inspired in a way. But we still have this idea that things get better with time, and that is true. And yet, also, things, to use the analogy that I hope gets me some points, things can be overbaked. You can be telling yourself, "I'm doing this," and I'm doing this extended thinking, and things will therefore be better. But often that's not always the case, because in fact, really, your interest has waned, and you're really kind of meandering away into something else by then. So you need to kind of strike at the right kind of time and act on those interests when they're really in focus.
It goes back to something I almost alluded to. It's an art. Some people are gifted and can do that very well and translate their ideas into a game. Some can't. And, I think how you just described it, I think fits perfectly with that. Sometimes it's as good as it's going to get. And try having a little bit more imagination, not add rules on how to start a fire in the middle of a wet rainforest. Like, squad leader, I'm talking about you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of Crisis, that was helped by the fact that Worthington they didn't put me under any pressure. They didn't say, "Hey, where's the game? We need to be shipping it because it's messing up our production schedules." They were, we had COVID as well, so that kind of interfered with things. But they were pretty much just, "Hey, just let us know when it's ready." And that version of the game that Kevin and Matthew played was ready. But I said, "You know what? I don't want to publish that. I want to give me more time. I want to think about this some more."
You're an artist.
But in contrast, so I did this. I'll tell you a contrary story, which is, you're familiar with the Consim Game Jam that Fred Saval organizes?
Oh yeah, and I judged with him at Zenobia. Love Fred.
Great. So I took part in actually the first and the second one, but in the second one. So that was last year in August, and I was about to not do it. I'd signed up at the last minute, but all the people that I was interested in joining a team with, my co-designer from Daniel Burt from the first one, where we did a game on Boudicca's rebellion in Roman Britain, he wasn't available, and a whole bunch of other people that I was really interested in working with, they, for all sorts of other reasons, they weren't around, they couldn't do it. And I remember my finger hovering over a button come out of the group chat to just kind of not do it. It's a lot of work. It's a weekend that is hard to manage. I got 2 small kids, so it was like, can I even really, should I be doing it? I ended up not quitting, and we did it. We made a game in whatever it was, 72 hours. We made it on the Treaty of Portsmouth, the 1905 treaty that ended the Russo-Japanese War, because I knew I wanted so the key to my top advice in doing a Consim game jam, or any kind of game jam really, is choose a topic where you can research it. It's small enough that there's limited amounts of research that you can actually get through the research stage fast enough to start making the game quickly. So, there is stuff written about the Treaty of Portsmouth, but it's not like you're trying to do the Pacific War in World War II or something. It's there's much less material to get through. And anyway, we made that game. I made it with 3 guys I just didn't know at all until we just randomly got put in a team together. A guy called SP Shaman and Nathaniel Barclay and Bill Sullivan. And we in fact, we won that competition. Jason Matthews and Candice Harris and Mark Herman were the judges. And in fact, about 2 weeks ago, we signed a contract with Kevin Bertram at Fort Circle to make that game, to turn it into an actual product. So in that case,
I may have heard about that.
So that game would not have existed had it not been for that game jam. It certainly would not have existed in that format, certainly not with those people who had no other way of meeting, were it not for that game jam. And even if it might have existed, because that treaty was on my mind, it would not be in any kind of timeline soon, right? It would be just a project kind of in the back burner, right? So there's an example of the kind of fires of urgency forging something that just had, came about through those circumstances.
I'm not gonna have to get with Fred. I want on the next one. I mean,
so
I don't
Fred
know if I'll
banned
help out
me.
much, but
Fred has banned me from taking part. I got because I think I came second in the first one, Daniel Bird, and then with those guys we came first in the second one. And I was always, my approach was like, I'd never done a game jam of any kind of digital form or analog form. And when the first one was announced, I thought I should do this because this might be a thing I set my students. I thought I got to walk the walk if I, going to talk the talk, right? I should do it. I should just see what it's like. So that was my motivation for doing it. And then, he said that I was not, I was banned from taking part in the future.
Because you were too good.
So a friend, Daniel Burt, the guy that made the Booker game with, that game is what turned into Rebellion Britannia, which is now with GMT. He said, no, I wasn't banned. I was exalted. So I thought, you know what, I'll take that. I'll get a T-shirt with that on it.
Yeah, slim difference, distinction something like that. So, before we put everybody in snooze, because I could talk to you for hours, and I have talked to you for hours. I want to get back to something that really kind of ties in a lot of your DNA and a talk I just had with Ross a couple of days ago. Storytelling within games.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as I met him at Connections, my whole thing was, ooh, we need that. We play games. I play for fun. I say that because I'm not good at them, I guess. I don't care if I win or lose. But there's that narrative storytelling element that you want the individual to clearly walk away having had an experience you created and maybe learn from it, maybe be informed, or, in worst case, they walk away and it doesn't change anything with an individual. How important is that? Well, obviously you think so, but why is that important? And how should game developers, up and coming game developers, kind of look at that as they put their designs together? Sorry for the disjointed question.
So let me come at this way. In screenwriting, there's a phrase that you've probably heard: "Show, don't tell." Right? It's a mantra of sorts to try and encourage writers to understand that it's much better writing in that medium to be having physical demonstrations of motivations than to be narrating them, right? So show, don't tell. We believe people by their actions rather more than by what they actually say. And this is a good, useful mantra that helps us keep that in mind. In games, we have a different hierarchy, which is an extended hierarchy, which is show, then do, then tell. So if you, sorry, I screwed that up. I mean, do, show, tell. So if you're telling, that's okay. But if you're showing, that's better. If you are doing, that's the best, right? So if a player can do it, that's going to be far more memorable, engaging. They're going to hold on to that moment. It'll have more meaning for them than if they're merely being shown it, right? They can take some ownership of it. It's kind of aligned to that concept we're talking about earlier with agency, right? So if you're able to construct game systems that facilitate your players to do, then it's just going to be more memorable. It's just going to be something that's, that's one of the unique affordable games. It allows players to participate in the story.
Yeah.
That's the gold dust right there. So it's the heart of everything. And this has changed a lot in the video game world in the last 20 something 30 years. When I was first hired, it was like, hey, we want to hire you we want you to throw this game. And the developers, the coders and the designers sort of either were literally or metaphorically in a glass office where you would kind of occasionally get to look in, and you might be invited occasionally to talk about your work. This has substantially changed. So now, in 2013, 14, I was working in Australia, part of 2K Australia, the pre-sequel, and I was a narrative director in that development team, where I was in those classes with the programming director, creative director, the art director, sound director, and narrative had a proper place at that table, which was great to see. And this is something that it's been wonderful to see that evolution, and to see how, in the 90s there was, people had their own proprietary tech, so that tech was what made people's games different. But now the ubiquity of middleware meant, what's the key differentiator? Why is my game different? It's probably Unreal, Unity, or Engine. But if you've got some understanding of how to place a product how to frame it, narrative, mining, zeitgeist, or audience.
And for some reason, you're breaking up a little bit, so I can edit part of this out.
Okay.
But you can hear me fine, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So we'll try it again. Probably just a glitch.
If you could edit out my screw up as well.
Oh no. It shows that you're a real human being. But sure.
So yeah, you could see how that the sort of the role of narrative has really become elevated in recent times, and becomes a central part of a game's identity.
Yeah. I think it's really important. And a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, he likes." This is another talk about antagogy. It's not, but I had to mention it just to get those haters all up about it. I think it's important. I think walking away from a game that has that flow and that story, because I have proven time and time again on the blog, writing is not easy, especially when you do it poorly. But like keeping that kind of flow throughout the game, I find that the games tend to be a lot better, a lot more interesting, and you're taking away the rewarding experience. And I think historically, a lot of game designers have just, it was by accident. But from talking to you, talking to Ross, when it's done with volition and it's done really well, I think it just increases the experience of the gamers, and that's pretty important.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's what we're driving at, right? Is the experience. We're thinking about the user or the player experience. And in a way to kind of bring us circle to Freeman's Farm, I did a talk for Sebastian Bay a couple of years ago.
That bozo?
So the GWS, the Georgetown University War Games Society, and I talked about storytelling and war game design, and I was really talking about how the combat system for Freeman's Farm is rolling lots of dice, right? But it's not what you might think. It's more like I suppose you might think of it a bit like Yahtzee, right? So you're rolling dice and getting hits. But if you don't get those hits, you can use your resources, which in this game is your morale or your unit numbers.
Mm-hmm.
You can reduce those to keep rolling until you do get what you want. And to me, that represented the sort of, in particular, the kind of bayonet charge assault of the British at that battle, and the way in which there was this risk reward. They kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and maybe they would get what they wanted, but at tremendous cost, in casualties. But my point was that what I was really interested in there was this theatrical moment where the dice roll was significant to the player experience. And I felt that in my experience, working with combat results tables and rolling dice and then checking the modifiers and rechecking them and counting them up and then doing all of that, I'd lost in that period of time, which might only be 10 seconds or might be a minute, depending on how complex those modifiers are. I'd lost this really essential moment, this kind of apex of the drama that seemed to me a real shame, because I realized that, and this might just be me, but I was losing a lot of dramatic payoff in the war games that I was playing by the nature of the combat design. And I realized, I experienced this a lot playing a lot of those Avalon Hill games in the 1980s on my own. I realized, I'm spending a lot of time maneuvering to avoid it because I can't be bothered to do the math that is connected to it. Well, that sure, but that to me is that's a red light for a designer there. That those moments, the combat should be the most dramatic and inviting moments in your design, rather your players are avoiding.
Yeah, it's almost like an orchestra that you build up the crescendo, and there's something about rolling a ton of dice, knowing that so much rides on it. I think that just adds a theatric element to games that I think if you have great mechanics and you understand the narrative element of the games, you create that tension within the games, and these become more rewarding experiences for the players. Some of them may never go back and reread the history, but you make that game session a memorable moment for them. And some games do that brilliantly. Some games that's their Achilles heel, that it doesn't create that type of fun, memorable experience. And I think I told you during the tour, I steal a lot from you guys in my work games, but you guys have an element I don't have, is you have to make your games fun for a very diverse audience. Mine's about analysis and about decision making. So it's easier, just that my players it's like herding cats, my man. It's totally like herding cats. But one thing I'm taking from this whole talk we've had, and actually even some of our previous ones, and I say this a lot, maybe I'll say it here again, is everybody thinks they could design a game. It's hard. But I think there's true artistry in it. And I keep getting asked, is it a science? Is it an art? Engelstein's book, The Craft, which kind of combines the two. Yeah, there's some scientific elements. You and I had a very long talk about Monte Carlo simulations, and I have follow up for that once I stop recording. But I think there's an art to it, and you laid out so many elements that, in my opinion, are invisible. They're totally ignorant of all of these elements that goes into the game. You know, a lot of times a game comes out and the only feedback you get is the negative, because I think our gamers aren't aware of some of those things. Well, did you enjoy it? I did, but it wasn't historically accurate. Oh, so you're one of those. I mean, it shows that there's real skill here, but it also takes the creativity of an artist, I think, to get a game right. And one of the, I'm going to make sure war game students listen to this podcast, because I think you lay out some of the elements that game designers and even, well, I'm going to go with every game player. I like talking in absolutes. Totally miss out on.
Yeah, if I could just add, just thinking about, so pacing is just what I want to say. I want to say that you think about things in a theatrical framework, that there's so much time from the beginning of class to the end of class, or the session, or whatever it might be. Well, structure that time. Think about how you can use that time for the most psychologically efficacious results, right? So think pacing isn't just, it's not, you couldn't possibly have a game that was great in so many ways, and but we just, it just plays slow and becomes dull. If it's playing slow and becomes dull, then it can't be a great game, I'm going to argue. I think that
I agree.
The way that you pace the game is critical, and you've got to work with the fact that we've got only so many dimensions, and you've got to place your work in that framework. So pull from theatre studies and the way in which, think about the way in which you control, manipulate audiences, the way that you conduct them. You talked a bit about an orchestra, like, to get you over the line, so at the point that you need to be. It's an accident that the class culminates 5 minutes from the end, or 10 minutes from the end of class. It shouldn't be. It should be and organized and structured, designed to get you there. Now, it might not be easy to do that, and it might take you out, and it might be timing that suits absolutely everyone in exactly the same way. But yeah, you've got to be aware of your audience, or your particular audience, and it can feel like designing into a void, because you're not sure if they'll care, or if they have anything nice to say. But in some ways, you've just got to trust your instincts. You're just getting better at it all the time as well. I feel like I'm still quite early on in my design career, and everything I'm doing, I'm getting.
Well, we need more designs.
Better at. Well, there's a lot coming. So,
which comes to the, how we wrap it up. I literally could talk to you for hours. We're just going to have you on again, but then again, I could talk to you without a podcast. It's the beauty of the modern world. So, spoilers. We always ask for some spoilers. So this podcast, by the time it's out, the game will be on Kickstarter. Go to our Facebook page. We will have links to it, and we'll have links to, of course, if you're listening to this, you should be able to see the link. But spoilers. I understand sometimes you can't say, sometimes you can't, but we always end off with the two last questions. Any spoilers? And what topic have you always wanted to design a game for that you have not yet, or nobody has? And then we'll send it back to Sean in the studio.
Well, so I mentioned a couple of designs. So there's this Rebellion Britannia, which is on P500 with GMT, which is a sort of, it's a game not about the invasion. The invasion's already happened. It's a game about Rome trying to contain rebellions, and on the side of the Britons, trying to agitate, perhaps fight each other, perhaps fight Rome, and it's not really an expansion game, not really area control exactly, but it's more like a co-opetition game between those Britain factions, and Rome is trying to play whack-a-mole with its few powerful legions to try and maintain control over the British Isles, or at least.
And that's the
England
one for Fort Circle, right?
So that's the one for GMT.
GMT. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Yep. What you said.
The one for Fort Circle is the Treaty of Portsmouth game called Peace 1905. So that's a 1 to 2 player game. It's a 2-player game where you either play as Japan or Russia, the lead diplomats trying to negotiate that peace. Similar kind of concept where to Crisis, where you could win too hard if you don't let anyone win any other issues, they'll storm out of the negotiations. You have lost, caused that. Basically, you've caused that treaty to not be signed, and you have incurred the wrath of really the rest of the world, right? The population of the rest of the world will see you as the reason why that failed. So you're trying to again
play that game. I just will never play that game with Sebastian Bay. He's a hard winner.
Well, then you'll win.
Yeah.
If he goes too hard at it. And there's a solo mode where you play as Teddy Roosevelt, who's trying to manage those different
Teddy
factions. So I'm not sure how many people know, but the Treaty of Portsmouth is quite a big deal in American political history because Teddy Roosevelt was instrumental in making that happen.
He was.
He got a Nobel Peace Prize for it. I think he was the first American to ever get a Nobel Peace Prize. And, it's probably his greatest political achievement, I think. But so that game I'm working on one about military intelligence and disinformation, but I can't say any more about that yet because the publisher asked me not to.
Because it would be disinformation, right?
I'm making a game about Camelot, the fall of Camelot, which I'm talking to Phalanx about that. So it's something slightly different. It's not historical. It's
Phalanx
fantasy.
out in Poland? Europe?
Yes. Yeah. I think
those guys.
in London. Yeah.
Yeah. They'll. I interviewed one of their guys that did that. It's like a smash between Here I Stand, but it's Napoleonic.
Mm-hmm. The coalitions.
Yeah. Coalitions. Yeah. I dig their approach to games, and I'm just going to leave it at that. I'd love to have Pavel on sometime and talk. I kind of like. Look, any company that puts out U-Boot is going to win something in my book. It's I like where they're going. I'm glad to hear that you're working with those guys. So so what's the white whale?
Probably a Napoleonic game. I've got a Leipzig concept which approaches the whole campaign, or at least the first half of that campaign. Or perhaps I'll focus on the second half. But that that campaign is interesting. I think that Napoleonics has always interested me. The politics of Napoleonic games is so difficult to address well. I think the way in which you have Austria and to a lesser extent Prussia changing sides, and how do you do that in a way that feels right? I'm interested to see. Yeah, we were just talking about Phalanx, and Yarrow is the guy I mostly know there. But so I'm curious to see how Coalitions approaches that. I think it's a real problem. It's a real problem to do well.
Yeah. So before we wrap it up, here's the last question we always ask. Mm-hmm. If I was in a felonious mood and broke into your house, I'm not going to. You live too far. What game on your shelf would I be surprised to see? Maybe your guilty pleasure. It's like going through somebody's iTunes. This is what you've downloaded, and you find like Taylor Swift on mine, which you won't. What would I be surprised to find on the shelf?
I think the maybe the Battle of Waterloo game that I have here, which is a Palatoy edition. It's actually, I haven't played it that much, but I had a very similar game. It was on the Battle of Balaclava, which was a 1970s game that's sort of a toy, really. It pieces just move along tracks, and you roll dice to move them along tracks, and it's looks like, yeah, it just looks like a sort of a dead end of game development. That, well, where on earth would this go? This is sort of when people didn't know how to make war games for a broader audience, other than just roll and move.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yes.
Well,
yes. Let me say, the games actually, I think, fed into why we have Freeman's Farm, because there's a way of managing the die rolls such that you sustain fewer casualties. So it ends up being a game. It's very, very extremely light, like probably a few hundred words rules, right? That's all. But I think that you would think, what on earth is that, and why would I have it? But it sort of nostalgia and fondness of playing a game like that, like I said, the Balaclava version in my youth, and because I think that it's a reminder that you can make accessible games, just for a broader audience.
all right. Well, then my basic question is, when you go on vacation, because that's when I most likely break in. Just kidding. I mean, could you imagine, God
I
forbid,
never go on vacation.
Me neither. Could you imagine, like, your house does get broken into, and it's like, he said it on tape. I don't know how I would spin that, but hey, it's been a pleasure. Crisis 1914. Yeah, you and I can talk, sir. Crisis 1914 on Kickstarter, an amazing game, and I say that because, yes, I love great war games, but I like what you're trying to do here. You know what I hate about Kickstarter games? I want them tomorrow. I want them the day after I hit go, and I gotta wait, and it stinks. But I'm sure I'm going to be talking to you again. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Mitch.
And anytime. And then we're going to turn it back to Sean in the studio. And of course, once we hit stop recording, we're going to talk about you personally. That's the audience.
Thanks so much for joining the show tonight. Remember to follow us on Twitter at No Dice, No Glory, and keep the conversation going on NoDiceNoGlory.com, now featuring our own message boards. Have a great night, everybody.